Yes, hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming to my talk this evening. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really happy that you all came, despite the somewhat confusing constellation of technologies. In fact, that I'm talking about web design at a .NET meetup. I'm really happy that I can be here. Today I want to talk about something that is very near to my heart, and that is the web and everything about the web component design. My name is Joy Heron. I'm a senior consultant at InnoQ. And I want to start out my talk this evening by talking with you all a little bit about my journey as a software developer. So when I started my professional life as a software developer, I focused primarily on back-end development. And the reason was not because I wasn't interested in front-end development. That always looked interesting to me. But I just found it extremely frustrating. So I would spend a lot of time working on something, and then I would, make the web page bigger, and everything just flies all over the place. Like, oh, what is CSS? Oh, Drecksprache. Forgive my German. And then, over time, I started to understand more about the web, about the architecture of the web, the way it was developed, why it was developed the way that it was developed. And I found that I began to understand, kind of at a deeper level, what the web is and why the languages that are developed for the web are the way they are. And then it started to click and make a lot more sense. When I started out, when I was learning how to program, I would use Stack Overflow and Google all the time. Look up, how can I do this with my HTML form? But I was asking those questions. How do I do this? How do I move this thing 5 pixels this direction? But I wasn't asking the fundamental question of what exactly is it that I'm trying to do here? Is there a better way to do it? And so over time, I've kind of become more familiar with the web, and I've fallen in love with the web and the architecture of the web. And now I want to share with you all tonight my method of thinking about web development, thinking about component-based web development. Exactly. So a little story starts in the spring of 2016. My product owner came to me and asked, I want to build a web application which manages requirements. I said, okay, that sounds good. And it should look like a table, and we should be able to sort the columns, and we should be able to filter the columns by typing things into the box. Building Excel for the web, because having Excel itself isn't enough. And so I said, okay, that looks like something I could do. That might be fun. So I did it. I thought, after that, I was like, maybe I did that one time. Sounds good. Probably never going to use that skill ever again. And lo and behold, in the summer of 2016, just 6 months later, I came to a completely different business context. But I had exactly the same requirements. Show data as a table, and make this data sortable, make this data filterable. And spring of 2017 is the same thing. Different technologies maybe on the back end, different business contexts, completely different things, but it all looked the same. And in the fall of 2018, the 5th time I was asked to build exactly the same thing, I had to ask myself, what about the future? I kind of feel like this is not the last time that I'm going to build a table for a web application that will need to be sorted and will need to be filtered. Why am I always implementing the same thing over and over and over again? The thing is, because I come from the back end. I'm a back end developer, full stack developer. And in the back end, I wouldn't do this. If I asked myself, would I really copy something from project to project? The answer is that I would not. Because we have these, in the back end, we have lots of abstractions. If I reuse something, if I copy something 5 times, at a certain point I say, okay, I'm done copying this now. I'm going to put it in a library. I'm going to make it possible to reuse this module between projects because I don't want to reinvent the wheel over and over again. And so this is the same idea I have with front-end development. I notice a pattern that I'm reinventing over and over again. And so when I do this, we can use the rule of 3. So I copy it twice. So I write it once, copy it another 1, 2. And then once I've copied it a few times, I can know what really is a good abstraction for this. So it's best not to prematurely abstract and just create a component based on what I think might be the common behavior between modules, but instead we can copy it a couple of times and see what really is the abstraction that I want to use. We can do the same exact thing for front-end development. So now we want to find an abstraction. So basically the abstraction is I render a table in my web application, and then I want to send some HTTP request to a server and get back a new table with the data that has been filtered by the criteria that have been specified by the user. And then the technology that we can use to build this with the front-end development is web components. That's exactly what I did in this example. I created a web component. It's called Tabella. The reason is I was thinking, I want to build a reusable web component that's a table. What can I name it? Naming, as we all know, is the hardest problem in computer science. But then I was thinking, table, I'm thinking in English, and then I realized, Tabelle. It's a German word. It actually sounds like a pretty table. And I can use that. As my web component. It also was available in the NPM repository, so took it right away. And then, so I wanted to build this using web components. But what is a web component? Because a component is something that we can kind of define the way we want to define it. So it could be everything or nothing. But depending on who you talk to, they have a different view of what a web component actually is. And so I want to talk about web components today. And for me, what a web component is always has a basis in HTML. HTML is the language of a browser. When your browser, even if you're using JavaScript to render HTML in your client, at the end of the day, what you are rendering and what the browser understands is HTML. That's what you actually see. So for me, the HTML is a vital component of a component. And on top of the HTML is the base. So that's I write some HTML. That's the base for my component, the structure of my component. And on top of that, I probably add some CSS. Because even though I can make a website that works using only HTML, it might not be very pretty. So we can add some CSS to make it pretty. And then on top of that, kind of building on these building blocks, building on these fundaments, kind of like an icing on the top of the cake, we can use JavaScript. And JavaScript we can use to make our application better, to make it more interactive, maybe make it flow more easily. And it's not necessarily critical for using web components. So this is kind of where it gets a bit confusing, because there is also a JavaScript specification for web components. But for me, I like the JavaScript specification for web components, particularly custom elements. I'm going to be talking about that at the end of my talk. But for me, you cannot take HTML and CSS out of the web components specification, because they are the fundamental building blocks. You can't you can't build a web application with only JavaScript. At the end of the day, you are somehow generating HTML and CSS. And it's best to begin with the HTML, in my opinion. It's best to begin with the HTML and add the CSS and JavaScript on the top. So this is kind of all in a component. I've just listed the languages in the web, but how is this? So this is the web part, but how is this a component? So with components, I'm looking for functionality that I can reuse and compose together. So here, the single responsibility principle is very important. Each component that I write should do one thing, and it should do that one thing really well. And if we need more functionality, we can just write another component and either compose the components together or just put them next to each other if they don't need to have anything to do with each other. This is one of the benefits of the HTML first approach, which I've talked about, that HTML composes naturally. You always have the child nodes or the child elements which come inside the parent node and compose inside of the parent element. Or you can just put HTML elements next to each other if they have nothing to do with each other. So this is one of the reasons why I really like the HTML approach. So the next question I had is, how do I find web components? Well, if I look visually, if I look at a user interface design or idea, I can see the patterns which repeat themselves. So I have this thing in my picture here. I see something that looks like a box that's supposed to be where a user would type something in. And then I see these arrows, and that's something the user can select to sort the column upwards and downwards. It also is a pattern that repeats itself. There's also this kind of grouping around all of these elements, which could also be a component, and one big component all around to group these all together, the table component itself. So I want to use this example to as an example throughout this talk. I'm going to also talk about different tips and tricks with web development, but this is kind of a running example that I'm using to explain the concepts that I'm talking about. So the first component we want to look at is this search box, and the first step in my my design process for components is to make it work. So here, how we make something work? Well, HTML provides some elements out of the box. So we can take the input type text element if we want to have the user type something to a box, or a select HTML element in order to select, for the user to select an option from a dropdown. And the really cool thing about this is I can have it in the back of my mind. If later I wrap a form around these input elements, then I automatically get, like the form, the default behavior of a form is to take the input, which the user has dynamically entered, into these input fields and encode that as an HTTP request and send it to the server, which is exactly what this is exactly what I want. So I want the user to be able to input something and then an HTTP request to be generated from that. And I just think it's really cool. I actually got a master's degree in computer science without knowing how an HTML form works. So I know it is really simple concept, but it's not necessarily something that everyone knows. Yeah, but I love it. HTML form is my favorite HTML element because everyone should have a favorite HTML element. I know it's a bit geeky, but that's okay. So now I have a component which works, but does it work for all users? The first tip I want to share with you all is that if you want to make sure that your web's application is actually accessible, particularly accessible for screen reader users, you should actually use a screen reader. Yeah, you should actually use a screen reader. So one thing I want to mention about this is that it's actually very useful to use a screen reader even to get a feeling for what is the flow of my information within my application. So when you are testing an application using a screen reader, the screen reader will literally read everything in your application out to you. And I find this actually helps me if I'm listening to my web application. It helps me to understand, okay, is the flow of information that I'm getting within my web application, is it in the right order? Is this, when a user comes to my site, is this the order of the information that I want to present to my user? And also it helps if there's any extraneous information which the user probably didn't want to know at that moment. They're trying to select options for a restaurant they want to go to, and you're telling them 5 different addresses of restaurants, and they're like, what, do I need to know the address at this point? And the screen reader completely annoys you, and then you realize, maybe if I take out that address, that extraneous information that doesn't help the user at all in this context, then maybe my whole application will become better. So I actually, just to make your application better, I actually highly recommend running it through a screen reader. So let's test our component with a screen reader to see how it would sound to someone using a screen reader.
Edit text. You are currently on a text field inside of web content. To enter text in this field, type. To exit this web area, press Control, Option, Shift, up arrow.
So this is a screen reader in VoiceOver. If you have a Mac, it comes pre-installed. Any other operating system, it's really easy to get a screen reader as well, so we really don't have an excuse for not installing and using a screen reader, except that we say it's too hard to use, but I think it's easy enough to be able to learn how to. It's kind of frustrating, I'm not gonna lie, but I find it kind of frustrating to learn how to navigate using a screen reader because I don't know the key combinations. But I find the value that I get for it is definitely worth the effort that I have to use in a screen reader. So how can we make this accessible? Well, here we can add an area label attribute to our input element, which will tell the screen reader the context about this input field. What is it supposed to do? Then it sounds like this.
Filter column 1, edit text. You are currently on a text field inside of web content. To enter text in this field, type. To exit this web area, press Control, Option, Shift, up arrow.
So now the user at the screen reader will know exactly what will happen when they type into the box. They will filter column 1. Now we have an HTML component which works for all users. And the next step in my process is that I make it pretty. But here I have 2 question marks, and the reason is that CSS, we're going to use CSS to make it pretty, but CSS is actually harder to override than it is to write in the first place. And so my tip for this is that if you want to write a web component which is reusable in as many contexts as you possibly can imagine, make the CSS minimal. So you can make some things, if you don't like how they look visually, you can add some minimal CSS, but make it minimal and have the in your head that it make it easy to override your styles later. Because nobody wants to have to write a CSS selector which has like a chain of 20 different classes, because that's how you have to write the CSS in order to get it specific enough to override the default styles from the vendor who created the web component. So here I'm just adding a CSS class which will allow me to allow users to write their own styles later, but I'm not actually going to add my own styles at this point. And with JavaScript, is there anything I can do to make it better? At this point, there's not really anything I need to do, because the components that I have, I know in the back of my head I'm going to wrap them in a form later, and they're going to do exactly what I want them to do. So I'm going to stop there. I don't need JavaScript. The second component that I have is these arrow buttons here, like up here. And these are for allowing the user to sort the column. So they can press 1 to sort it ascending, like press up or down to sort ascending or descending. And the first step I have is I want to make it work. So what we need, here's a little animation showing what we want. We want the user to be able to select one of the arrows and sort the column, but only one should ever be selected at any given time. And then when the user's, later HTTP request will be generated. Does anybody know what HTML element has exactly this behavior? It's not supposed to be a trick question. Anyway. An element that has exactly this behavior is a radio button. So if I have a radio button which has the same name, the name sort, I can only ever select one of those from the browser. So if I select sort ascending, then it will select sort ascending. But if I then select sort descending, the sort ascending will be deselected. And if I wrap it in a form later, this value will be sent to my server. So let's run it through a screen reader and hear what it sounds like.
Sort column 1 ascending, radio button, 1 of 2. You are currently on a radio button, 1 of 2, inside of web content.
So here we're using label, the HTML label elements. We don't need the area label attribute because the HTML label element already binds the input field to the input field to the text or the label, and that's why here we can see that the it already sounds pretty good in a screen reader. So it already works for all users, but it's really not pretty. I mean, we don't want that in our web application. So we do want to make it pretty at this point. And one tip I have is that you can select an input element by clicking on its HTML label. So this means that we can actually style the labels to look like arrows, and then we can move the radio buttons off screen. So this is some CSS, like a CSS, SCSS here at this point. So what this does is that it moves the content off screen. So it's still available to the screen reader, but you don't visually see a radio button. And then what I can do is that I can visually hide my radio buttons, and I can style the labels to add an arrow in front of them, which looks like this. And I can add checked, add styling for the different states of my radio button. So when it's already checked, or when I'm doing hover and focused input states, so I can see what the state of my component is. And at the end, I can then hide the text of the label, so it's still available to the screen reader, but it looks exactly like this component, which we were talking about before. So then we can double check the accessibility. Yeah, I didn't add the audio again, but it will sound exactly the same because it's exactly the same HTML element under the hood. It just looks different. It looks like two arrows now instead of radio buttons. So now I have CSS, and it's pretty. And the question is do I want to add JavaScript? Not right now. You could add JavaScript on the top later to allow you to deselect radio buttons, because that's not behavior that's delivered by the browser by default. But it still will work without JavaScript, so I'm not going to touch that right now. So now I've talked about two components, but I also here I want to kind of take a little segue. I want to talk about how we can maintain components over time, because as we know with software, it's not that you write something one time and then I'm never going to see that again. It grows over time, and it morphs over time, and it becomes very large over time, or it becomes maybe less nice over time. So how can we maintain our components over time? One tip I have is that you can use a templating engine as an abstraction for your component. So instead of developing a web component and then copying the HTML, one method for then distributing your components to copy the HTML markup between projects. But if you ever want to change that markup in any form, in any way, you then have to go through all the projects that use that component and update the markup in the same place. But we can use a templating engine to do this. So then if we have our component inside a template, we can change it once inside our template, and it modifies all instances. That really makes it easier to maintain our components over time. And we can also publish. This is one thing I really like. We can publish our templates as a library, which other projects can then use. So our templates then become a product. So this is a quote by Brad Frost, which I really like. We need a big mental shift from let's build a website to let's maintain a product which other products use as a dependency. So I can have all of my components. I consider them to really be a build artifact, which I create and publish, and other with versioning, please with versioning, and then other products can use that library which I have developed. So this, I'm just wrapping them in templates so that I can then use them. This is using JSX syntax. This is complete. It's a component-based templating library, which I work on with some colleagues. But that's not the point here that I'm trying to make. My point is just to decide on a templating engine and then consider those to be really a build artifact, which you then can reuse across projects. Another tip I have is that you can use a pattern library or a style guide in order to develop your components. So the front-end tooling in the front-end universe has expanded by leaps and bounds in the past few years, I would say. And there's these really cool tools, like pattern library tools, where you can get it, use your template and test out different things very quickly without having to start the whole application with an application context in a database in order to get the data that you need in order to show the component and play around with things. So I really like using pattern libraries. And one thing, what I do, which I really like, is that this uses Node NPM. I know, it's horrible. We don't like it, but it's sometimes useful. Or maybe, is there anyone here who loves NPM? I didn't, oh great. I've insulted some people and they're going to leave. I'm sorry. It's a very useful tool. Now I'm being pragmatic. I apologize. But I really like, there's some pattern library tools where you can develop your components inside the pattern library. And because it's an NPM package, then you can actually publish it to an NPM repository and then reuse it in other projects as an NPM library. Then the question I then have is, how does this work in a team? Because as we know, most of the problems in software projects are organizational and not technical, although technology sometimes causes problems, but organization causes problems that are more annoying. So one thing I talked about, I like to use a pattern library and then to kind of play around with my components, publish them, and then reuse them in a different product that I'm developing. So this is the kind of the start of this process. So I have a simple team which is responsible for both the pattern library and the product, and they're developing it at the same time. And the nice thing about doing this is that if I suddenly get the requirement that I need another product, even if it has nothing to do with the business logic can be completely different or it can be similar, that's not important. But the really nice thing about doing it this way, publishing your components as a library, is that you can then really easily reuse those components as soon as someone else says, oh, you know, I need another application tomorrow. You're like, oh, how do I write all this front-end code? But you already have it, and you can just reuse the components that you've spent so much effort developing and maybe add some new components. But then you can move a lot quicker because you don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time. This works great, but what happens when we have to split our teams? So when I'm talking about teams here, I'm talking about cross-functional teams. So there maybe it's a one-person team, but it doesn't happen that often. Maybe you are a one-person team. I think even if I was a one-person team, I would still want to develop with a style guide or a pattern library personally. But most of the time, we're working with some cross-functional teams. So we have people in the team which have different levels of expertise. Some might have really strong back-end focus and not be able to do so much in the front end. Some might be full-stack developers doing some business code in the I think I'm in here somewhere. I'm probably this person. So I can do all the back-end stuff, but as soon as it gets into the database, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna Google this. And I'm trying to become a designer. I'm a wannabe designer. So that's me inside the team. But everyone in the team has different strengths, and we can balance each other out and develop really great products together. But here, where does web components fit in here? You notice here, we don't have a front-end team and a back-end team. They're all inside the same team. And one thing I love about this is that the web components, this is my experience, web components actually become a language between the back-end and the front-end. So the front-end developer, somebody who's really into CSS and HTML, can write really great components and then provide those to the backend team as templates, and the backend team's so great, I know exactly which data I'm going to put in these templates. And so they can, some of the backend people who do more backend than frontend, can use templates even if they don't know how, for instance, how the CSS implementation underneath works. And it really is helpful, because if you have some good components for layout and different things. And here's some layout concepts. We have 3 different layout concepts, one with a sidebar and a main content area, one with just a main content area, and all of these different things. We have these components here. You can use them, put whatever content you want inside. Backend developers are like, great. And then they make a site, and then they're like, oh, look, it actually looks nice. And I didn't have to write a single line of CSS. And then they get really happy. And the front-end developers also really happy because they can focus on developing really nice components that the backend team can then use. And as I said, this is a cross-functional team, so there is definitely a place to do both front-end and backend. It's a valid choice. But when we split teams, there's a coordination overhead which does come. As we know, coordination is fun. And so for me, when we're talking about how do we split teams and how do we make this still be possible to develop a user interface which looks similar across different products that are developed by different teams, that's more difficult. If you wanted to say we can have different teams which develop web applications which look completely different and it doesn't matter, then that's also a valid strategy. But they'll probably get more and more dissimilar to each other over time. But what we can do is, once we know that we're going to split teams, we had this global pattern library before, and this global pattern library we can continue to consider to be this global artifact that everyone can use. And some people, so I've kind of listed them here, so here's a blue guy and a red guy. They're part of these other 2 teams. I think they call it a front-end guild. I'm not sure the terminology. There's different terminology. But the idea is that some people from the different teams should work together on this global pattern library and still provide that for the different users. But they're also working on their respective products. Maybe if it might be possible that people would work full-time on the global pattern library. I think that's also a valid strategy. But the idea is then that these teams also have their own pattern libraries or components, so they have the ability to create their own components, so they have the flexibility to try different things out and do different things. And if they find something that works really well, they can then contribute that back to the global pattern library so that others maybe can profit from it if they think it's something that others can maybe profit from. So that's just one idea. But here what we want to do is we want to avoid throwing components over the wall. That's why I said it's so important that we have cross-functional teams. So we're talking. It's not like it's like you're the back-end people, I'm the front-end people. But it's bringing the teams together to work on different things together and not just be like, oh, here's a component, use this, and then it didn't work, and then we want to collaborate. And there's loads of different team constellations, but in all of them, what we want is we want to release new versions of our components as quickly as we develop new ideas. We don't want to be, gebremst. I don't remember the English word for that, so I'm speaking Denglish. I'm sorry. So we want to release versions of our component library very quickly, and we want to be able to upgrade our templates really quickly without having to worry about breaking changes. So one tip I have is that when you're publishing a library of templates, please keep the components backwards compatible to make it really easy to upgrade. How can we make components backwards compatible? There's different ways. One thing is when you add new parameters to your template, make them optional, or add a default value so you don't breaking the people who are already using the template. Instead of breaking a component, I've heard of very few good reasons to break. I mean, just in general, I have heard of very few reasons why you should break existing code. If you have any good reasons, you can talk to me after the talk. But instead of breaking a component, I can just create a copy of the existing component and then give it a new name. So instead of having, I have a banner, and now I have now the requirement from somebody is you need a banner with an image. So instead of creating a banner component and then make a breaking change to add the image, you can create a separate component, which is banner with image, which is just next to the first component, maybe uses some of the implementation, but it doesn't break the existing components which use the existing products which use that template already. And then this is the difficult one, is to avoid depending too strongly on the structure of your component when you're using UI tests, or if you're using the component within other UI tests. So when you're writing UI tests in your product, it can be easy to be like, okay, there's a chain of 3 different classes which will always exist. And so I'm going to write a UI test with that. But if it's too strict, then and you change the markup, you can break your UI test, which can be frustrating. So it's best to try to find the best selector that is not that brittle, so you have some flexibility. But it's, as I said, it's a bit difficult, that point. So now I want to go back to the rest of the components that we wanted to evaluate. And I'm going to be talking about this third component, which I decided before, it kind of groups these elements together. And first of all, I want to make it work. So as I said before, we just want to kind of group them together. There is an HTML element which does this, and that's the div element, which does literally nothing except group elements together within an HTML document. So it does work, and it is accessible in a sense that all of the information that you put inside the div element is available to the screen reader, and it will read it out to you. But if we put this through a screen reader, it will literally read, if I want to go to column 3, it will literally read every single element, column 1, and it'll say sort column 1 ascending, sort column 1 ascending, and it'll read all of this information out to me that I have to go through all of that information in order to be able to get to my column 3, which can be very annoying. So one tip I have is that if you have this kind of situation, we can wrap fields together in a role group, which adds a navigation level to a screen reader. So here I can add the role group attribute and add an area labeled by attribute, which takes the ID of an element, which is a label for my group. And then when I run it through a screen reader first, it'll tell me column 1 group, and I can decide, do I want to go into the column 1 group? And if not, I can navigate with my screen reader to the next group. And then it takes me to column 2 group, and then I decide, oh, I want to go and filter column 2. So then I can move into that navigational group in the screen reader, and then it will read out all of these options for me. So I have now an HTML element which works for all users, and I want to make it pretty. I don't know if anyone here has had the experience of programming with CSS. I kind of mentioned it before at the beginning of my talk, where you really want to put this box here. And then you've managed somehow with some hack that you looked up on Stack Overflow to move this box here and then put this box underneath, and then you minimally change the size of your browser window, and everything just like goes everywhere. I call it HackaMole CSS. I don't know if you know the game Whack-A-Mole, where you hit one of the moles and then the other one pops out everywhere. What's the name in German? Does anyone know? Sorry. Maybe the Americans are more brutal and Germans are like, no, we don't hit moles on top of the head. But my tip for CSS, now there's great CSS layout options in modern CSS, which are Flexbox, Grid. And these allow us to really design a CSS container. So my tip is to design your CSS like a box of chocolates. So you design your container with love, and then you can place your components inside of it, and they just stay there where you would expect them to stay there. So here I wanted to design, I'm going to use this example for using CSS Grid. Flexbox is also great, but it's a different layout mechanism, and you can use both depending on what use case you have. But here I want to use CSS Grid because I realize what I want it to look like kind of looks like a grid. So I have this header area which spans 2 rows, and then next to the header I have my up arrow and my down arrow, and a search bar on the bottom which spans both columns. And with CSS Grid, you can write this in CSS Grid And basically using ASCII art, you can tell your CSS, you can tell the browser exactly what layout you want. So this CSS on the right-hand side, we can see how that pretty much exactly corresponds to the image that I drew on the left-hand side. And I can also say how wide my columns should be. So using grid template columns, I can say I want the FR unit will take up as much space as it wants, as it can, and how as much space as it wants. And so I can say the header field and the search field should take up as much space as is available. And the arrow buttons, they only need auto. They only need as much space as they need. So that was the first step, is to design our container. And now I can just place my children inside of my grid. So here I can see using the grid area, here the grid area, grid area, oh, the spotlight's not working. Oh, there you go. The grid area in my CSS, I can bind the grid area to my CSS classes, so I can literally just write my CSS and say the header element, I want that to go in grid area header, the arrow ascending element, I want it to go in arrow ascending grid area, and so on and so forth. And when I do this, voila, so they're just placed exactly where I wanted them in my CSS layout, and I'm happy almost. One thing is that I want to vertically center my text within my header component. And with the last text, the one tip is that with CSS Grid or Flexbox, vertical alignment is finally easy. Historically, it wasn't so easy, but now we can just say align self-center on our header component within our tabella header, and then it will align itself vertically inside of its box. And then wrap it in a template for reuse. And so now we have an HTML component which works for all users. It's pretty. And do we need JavaScript for making it better? For this kind of component where you're really only doing layout, I would advise you to not use JavaScript. Like, avoid it at all costs. As all costs. There probably is some kind of reason you might need it at some point, sometime in the future. But for this kind of layouting job, CSS with the modern CSS layouting utilities is really the best way to do layout. And it's very robust as well. So we don't want to use JavaScript there. And as you can see, I'm on slide 76 and I haven't actually talked about JavaScript at all. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about JavaScript. Because the last component that I want to talk about is this table element that wraps around everything else. And the component, first step is want to make it work. We kind of saw before that when I wrap all these input elements that I've already designed inside of form, the user, this will submit user filter queries. So we can see this in action. This is without writing any JavaScript at all. But we can see, we can type things into the boxes and submit it. You can also sort it. So it actually works without any JavaScript, even though it's maybe not as interactive as I would like. So I do have an HTML component which works for all users. Here with CSS, I'm also going to make do the same thing as I talked about before, as I'm going to put that on pause for now and not worry about the visual design of the table. But I can make it better using JavaScript. One thing we can do is that we can submit our forms asynchronously, and then replace our document object model in our browser with the result table that we got from the server. So one of the reasons is that when we do this kind of form submitting thing, it does send a request to the server and gets another page back, so it kind of feels a little bit janky. It just pauses for just a second with our fast browser connections. You just see like it blink a little bit. But we can get around this by just submitting the forms with JavaScript and replacing our table when it comes back. And the nice thing about this is it also makes it faster, because one of the things that takes the most time
one of the reasons developers of like single-page apps say, "Oh, it's such a smooth experience," is not because HTML is actually bigger than JSON. It's not. It's roughly the same size. I mean, depending on what you're doing, of course. But the reason that a single-page app experience where everything happens in JavaScript, it feels maybe a little bit faster. The reason is because the assets don't have to be parsed every single time. So the JavaScript and the CSS doesn't have to be loaded and parsed and loaded into the browser on every single page load. But we can get exactly the same behavior when we submit our form asynchronously with JavaScript and just replace the body of the HTML table. It's quite easy to write JavaScript functions which do this. I can write a function pretty easily to serialize my form and then submit it using the fetch API. I'm kind of just considering the happy path here, and the text, the JavaScript is a bit more complicated than this, but just to give an idea. And then once I've written the submit function, when I can write a function which will replace the T body of my table with that from the server. And I can override the default submit behavior of my form by overriding the submit event on the form add event listener and calling event prevent default. But here, so we have now an initialize submit. I apologize for my pronunciation. We have an initialize submit function, and the question you then have is who calls the initialize function. Historically, when we wrote a component, adding a component dynamically used to require both the HTML markup that we wrote and the function that we had to call in order to initialize it. And there's a part of the web component's JavaScript specification, which is called custom elements, which solves exactly this problem. So here I can define a custom HTML element, which will appear in my HTML document in my browser, and then also define a hook. How should I instantiate this component as soon as it's loaded by the browser? And then the browser knows what to do, and it will then instantiate your component for you. So this is what it looks like. We can write a JavaScript class, which extends our HTML element. And we can add behavior to the connected callback method inside of our class to do the initialization logic. So here we want to call our initialize submit function from before. And we can define our custom element using custom elements.define and the tag name that we want to appear in our HTML document. So then, once we've done this, we can just add a tabella element to our HTML document, and the browser will take care of the initialization for us as soon as it is ready to do so. It also provides, custom elements also provide scope, and this function is bound to the HTML element itself and its native JavaScript API. We can also make it better by adding, making the implementation more dynamic by triggering submits when an input element changes, remembering to debounce the key up events if we're adding a listener to a text, an input type text element. And we can do so much more. We can really do a lot here to make our tabella, make it interactive and a lot more things. But that's all I really have for you tonight. This is what it looks like when we've added the JavaScript over the top, so we can see it does make it feel more interactive and better. There's no flash because it's not doing a whole round trip to the server. Yeah, so that we now have an HTML element component which works for all users. It's pretty, and it's also faster and dynamic. Thank you very much for your time. Are there any questions?
Given you would publish this component to every one of us,
Yes.
and we want to start to use Tabella,
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
So how do you track those dependencies within your global component?
Okay, the question is that there is a dependency with the backend component. I think what I would say is that with the component, I'm focusing on the front end, and I'm saying the contract that I want to have with the server. So the server can do the filtering and the sorting and the how do you say pagination? Paginierung? I think, yeah, German, sorry. Don't know the English word. But the server we can decide on the best technology for the server that works for the use case that we have. So one thing is that for some use cases, Postgres might be fine, but for others we need a Solr cluster or something in order to be able to search better. And so in this instance, I don't really want to. I want to define a contract. So I want this kind of contract with the server. So it understands this HTTP request, and I want it to give me an HTML table back. That's what I want. But I don't want to require any other contract in this instance. Yeah. I'm not sure. I just commented it. In answer to your question. I did write this github.com/inoq/tabella has my implementation of this web component, but I did just comment the contract that I expect from the server.
Any other questions? If not, then thanks, Joy.
Thank you.